Hi, welcome to the Wetlands 101 educational video series. My name is Kathy Reed. I'm a wetland specialist and I work out of our Central Regional Office. Today we're going to focus on wetland vegetation that it's needed to satisfy a wetland delineation report, some tips about how to identify plants, and also some techniques and tips to use to review wetland delineation reports when they come in for your review.
In the way of review, remember that plant cover is one of 3 parameters that are needed to show that an area is a wetland. There must also be soil present that has been altered by water. The soil and hydrology requirements are described in other segments of the educational series. To satisfy the plant requirements for an area to be called a wetland, the majority of the plants must be water-loving plants, or hydrophytic. The methodology that you use to determine whether or not the vegetation component is met is the same for both eastern and western Washington, just the plants you are working with are different. The definition of a hydrophytic plant pulls in the influences of the water regime and the soil on the plants that you see in a wetland. Plants that you find in wetlands are adapted to a low oxygen in the soil. How well they are adapted to not having much or any oxygen in the soil helps determine the likelihood that you will find them in a wetland. The percentage of the time that they are found in a wetland area is used by experts to assign them a wetland indicator status. This is the sequence that one should go through to evaluate whether the vegetation criterion is met at a particular observation point. This information is then recorded on a delineation form that supports conclusions of the wetland boundary location report, which is also called a wetland delineation report. We will now look at each one of the sequence elements in greater detail. First, observe and record the plants that are present in each strata. Herbs include all non-woody plants. Grasses, sedges, and stinging nettle are some examples of common herb layer plants. Woody vines, like vine maple, can grow as high as the trees that they are attached to, but they are evaluated separately from the tree strata. The shrub layer is made up of woody plants that are self-supporting and have trunks less than 3 inches in diameter. DBH is an abbreviation for diameter breast height, which means you are looking at the diameter of the plant trunk at the height of approximately 4.5 feet above the ground to do your measurement. One species of plant, depending on the size of the individual plants, could be counted in both the tree and the shrub layer. This graphic illustrates how one would sort out vegetation of different types. Herbs are generally under 1 meter in height, but some herbs like cow parsnip or bulrush can grow quite tall. This picture shows the areas where different strata can be found. Remember that the lower strata can also be found under the taller strata. The next step consists of 2 parts, and that is to identify the plant list that you must use depending on where your site is located, and record the indicator status from the appropriate plant list. This map shows that there are 2 different regional plant lists that you might be using if you are working in eastern Washington: Arid West, or Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coast. The plant list one uses corresponds to the same Corps of Engineers Regional Delineation Manual supplement that is being used to delineate the site. The division between use of the 2 different supplement manuals and corresponding plant lists is based primarily on precipitation averages. Generally, the Arid West manual is used in areas with less than 15 to 20 inches of average rainfall. When the site is in an area of higher precipitation, then the Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coast manual and plant list should be used, even though you are in eastern Washington. One of 5 possible indicator statuses are assigned to each plant on the list by experts that are familiar with that particular region of the country. Obligate, facultative wetland, and facultative status assignments indicate water-loving or water-tolerant plants. Facultative upland and upland plant status means the plants don't tolerate living in wet conditions for very long. The indicator status of a plant is important in doing the math to determine whether or not an area has wetland vegetation or not. We will go into some of the details about how that is done later. So back to plant identification. Here are some quick hints for how to collect information about plants if you are not an expert who can simply identify the plants while you're out in the field. The following photos give examples of a landscape and a close-up photo of a plant. After that are a few reference photos of some of the most common wetland plants you will see in wetlands in eastern Washington. When taking a landscape photo of a plant, you want to capture how it relates to other plants or objects around it. Himalayan blackberry prefers disturbed areas and shades out other plants. Sometimes it grows on or over other plants or objects like fences. Himalayan blackberry is common in both eastern and western Washington. A good close-up photo like this one of Himalayan blackberry shows details like leaf shape and arrangement of leaves on a stem. You should also take a close-up photo of any flowers or fruits on the plant that might still be on the plant. These details will help you or anyone who is helping you with plant identification. Himalayan blackberry is a common name that is sometimes implied in error to other blackberries. Not all blackberries have the same wetland status. That is why delineation forms should have the scientific name of the plant listed to the genus and species column. Rubus discolor is the scientific name for Himalayan blackberry. Rubus is the genus name, and discolor is the species name. Another thing that every person who deals with wetlands should know is how to tell a sedge from a grass. Why? Because sedges are usually found in wetlands and are almost always either wet or obligate. But grasses run the range of indicator status and are more often upland plants. Sedge leaf blade edges are so stiff and sharp that they can actually cut your hand if you are not careful. Here are some pictures to show you some of these differences up close. The orientation of the way you are holding a sedge gives a W or a M shape. Sedge leaf blades grow from the bottom of the sedge stem typically, whereas grass blades grow from various heights along the grass stem. Here is another test called the roll test that you can use to figure out whether you have a grass or a sedge or a rush. Grab a piece of stem and roll it. If the stem is hollow and crushes, it's a grass. If the stem is solid and rolls easily, the plant is a rush. If the stem feels angular and doesn't roll easily, the plant is probably a sedge. The key here is that if you find a sedge or a rush, you have the first piece of information that the site might be a wetland. If you find a grass, well, it can still go either way. Cattails are the one plant that most people recognize. Plus, they are usually found in places that are very wet. The fluffy seed pods are poised to be blown away by the wind in this photo. This is a very common obligate status wetland plant that you will find in very wet sites. It's called Scirpus microcarpus or small fluted bulrush. The common name is confusing because its leaves look like a sedge and its stem is triangular at the top and round at the bottom. While it usually grows about 3 to 4 feet tall, it can grow up to 5 feet tall in a high nutrient environment. This is Veronica anagallis aquatica or water speedwell. This plant is less than a foot high but is very common and likes to grow right beside or in shallow open water. It has opposite leaves. The tiny pink or lavender flowers have one petal of the 4-petal group that is shorter than the other ones. Red osier dogwood is a common riparian and wetland plant in eastern Washington and one of the easiest to identify. That is because there are so many clues that you can easily see to tell you what it is. First, the beautiful intense red bark. Second, the twigs and branches come off the main stems 2 at a time and exactly opposite each other. Third, the white flowers turn into tiny white fruits later on in the season. Red osier dogwood is also called red twig dogwood, and this feature is easy to see in the winter early spring on the younger branches before all the leaves have emerged. Very few native plants have such vivid red twigs. Our fourth clue is if you carefully crease a mature red osier dogwood leaf in half and pull it apart gently, the very thick phloem in this leaf veins will keep the leaf pieces together. This thick phloem is very distinctive to red osier dogwood. You can't do this with the leaves of most other plants because their phloem is not as thick. Also, note how the leaf veins are relatively big and easy to see on the face of the leaves. Urtica dioica, also known as stinging nettle, has leaves that are coarsely toothed and the leaves come off the stems directly opposite to each other. The green flower clusters are attached to the axil of the leaf and stem. The axil is where a leaf and the stem meet. Stinging nettles can get very tall, 5 to 6 feet, and if your skin isn't protected, you will not forget that you walked among them. Coyote willow, also called sandbar willow, is very flexible and bends easily so that it can survive heavy flooding without getting very damaged. Its scientific name is Salix exigua. This plant can resemble a Russian olive plant from a distance because their long, thin, olive-covered leaves look similar. This kind of willow can often be seen growing on the edges or in the middle of streams on islands that have thin soil or no soil at all, just cobblestones. Reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinaceae, is the plant that is visible in the foreground. It is very common all over the state of Washington and spreads by shallow roots called stolons, which can make a hard mat under the surface of the ground. It is a very competitive plant which chokes out other plants from growing in their midst. This is another view of reed canary grass in the foreground after the plant seed heads have matured a bit and some of the plants are starting to get brown and die back a little. More reed canary grass. You can see how different this incredibly common non-native plant can look, depending on what time of year it is and what environment it is growing in. It is important to be able to identify the plant in eastern Washington because it is a good indicator of where a wetland might be. The good news is there are a few tricks to know that can help you to identify this grass. First, reed canary grass leaf blades are usually more than 3/8 of an inch wide. Most other grass blades are much slimmer. However, be sure to use leaves on plants that have been growing for a few months to use this test. The second thing to look for is the presence of a very large, and what I mean by that is about 1/4 of an inch long, ligule. Ligules are whitish membranes on the leaf where the leaf blade is attached to the stem. You can see it easier on the leaf when you pull the leaf back away from the stem. Most other grasses don't have a ligule that is as long as that. Third, if you have a seed head that is mature enough to actually have seeds, you can mash it up in your hands to extract the seed, and the seeds will glisten in the sunlight as if they were already wet. There aren't many grass seeds that are shiny like this. When you put all these things together, you can be pretty sure that you have found some reed canary grass. Reed canary grass can be a problem in areas that you want to restore. It is very invasive and chokes out other plants, decreasing the plant diversity. However, it's good at erosion control because it forms a dense mat that helps the soil from eroding away in high water events. The tallest deciduous tree in the eastern Washington arid west region landscape is the black cottonwood. At maturity, it can easily grow to over 100 feet high. If you see a really tall tree in eastern Washington with older bark that is dark gray and that tree has triangular shaped leaves, it is probably going to be a cottonwood. Black cottonwood, or Populus trichocarpa, can hybridize with other plants in the Populus genera, so the leaves can look a little different than in this photo. Cottonwoods have separate male and female plants. Flowers on female trees, after being pollinated by windblown pollen from male trees in April, develop small green capsules, seen here, that split open in June to shed small seeds that are carried by the wind. Here is another close-up of some cottonwood leaves. This cottonwood fluff with embedded seeds can look like snow on the ground in the vicinity of female cottonwood trees, making the tree very unpopular with some of the homeowners or park managers. Rumex crispus is the scientific name for curly dock. It is a good indicator plant for eastern Washington in that it grows in disturbed wetlands. It is also found commonly in wetland buffer areas. This plant can be easily identified in late summer through winter because of its deep brown-red color and the persistence of its dried-up stems and leaves. Grazing animals don't like to eat it. As stated earlier, the time of year can make a big difference in what different plants look like. Curly dock doesn't stand out as much when its leaves are green before it has mature seeds on it. Russian olive trees, Elaeagnus angustifolia, have very gray-green leaves with some of their limbs growing close to the ground. They provide excellent cover for ground-dwelling wildlife, but because they are a non-native plant and grow aggressively and shade out other plants, many biologists don't like them because they decrease the diversity of native plants around them. Russian olive trees have gray leaves and tiny yellow flowers that turn into olives, which are visible after the flower ovary has developed. Russian olive trees also have reddish-brown branches with big thorns, sometimes as long as 1 inch, that can rip you up if you are not careful when moving around them. The leaves can look like willow leaves, but willow stems don't have thorns, and willow leaves don't droop toward the ground like Russian olive tree leaves do. Side by side in this photo, you can see how the leaves on the Russian olive trees droop down, but the similarly colored and shaped sandbar willow leaves point in all directions off their stems. This is a landscape view of Russian olive trees surrounding a wetland area in Amon Creek in eastern Washington. Lepidium latifolium, also known as perennial pepperweed, is a non-native plant and is commonly found in disturbed wetlands or wetland buffers in great quantity in eastern Washington. Its deep roots give it a big advantage in our arid area. Another common name for this plant is whitetop. Goldenrod, or Solidago canadensis, is an aggressive perennial native plant which also has an extensive root system. It grows in disturbed areas and roadside ditches. This plant is well known to people who suffer from allergies. The leaves of snowberry are arranged oppositely from each other on the stem. Leaves are usually oblong in shape, except sometimes on new shoots the leaves are lobed and look more like mittens or an oak leaf. Snowberry is often found growing near east side rose species like Nootka rose, bald-hip rose, or woods rose. Rosa nutkana is fac up and is one of the showiest and big-blooming native roses in Washington. The leaves are compound, which means that they have many leaflets on one leaf. And of course, there are thorns. How many leaflets are on one leaf and the size and abundance of thorns on a stalk can help with plant identification. Luckily, most native roses have similar indicator status. Rosa woodsii and Rosa gymnocarpa are fac up. However, Rosa piezocarpa is fac. Sepals are located below the flower petals and are usually green. Whether sepals remain attached to the rose fruit throughout the winter can be useful in identification of native roses because most of the native roses in eastern Washington do have sepals. Therefore, if you see a rose fruit that does not have sepals during the winter, then it is most likely a non-native rose. However, there are always exceptions, and Rosa gymnocarpa is one of the few native roses in eastern Washington that do not have sepals that stay on during the winter. Another challenge for rose identification is that native roses easily interbreed with non-native roses, so you may need to get an expert to help you when it comes to rose identification. Blue elderberry is a common shrub or tree in the riparian environment. Notice the round green fruits in this photo, which will turn a powdery blue color as they ripen. This plant also has compound leaves, meaning that there are multiple leaflets on the same leaf stalk. Mahonia repens, or creeping Oregon grape, is a common upland plant in eastern Washington. Lupine is another upland plant which is very distinctive with its bunching body mass, showy flower stalks, and palmate compound leaves. Look closely at the individual flowers and you will see that it is in the pea family. Sumac, or Rus glabra, is a common shrub or tree-sized native plant found in drier portions of the riparian area. It is easily recognized by the dark red spikes at the end of stems and the very large compound leaves, which can have between 7 to 29 leaflets. Because this particular species is not listed in the most recent plant list, one can assume that it has an upland plant status. However, because other sumacs are listed as having a facultative upland status, it might be worth calling an expert to make sure. We've been talking a lot about the plant status that different plants are assigned. These codes are assigned to each plant by experts, and they are important in doing the math to determine whether or not an area has wetland vegetation or not. Lists of plant species that are often found in wetlands have been compiled nationally and specifically for each region of the U.S. The United States Army Corps of Engineers recently received authority to maintain the lists. You can count on them to have the most recent list posted on their website. The indicator status of the same plant can be different depending on what area of the United States you are in. Be mindful that the correct list must be used. Also, make sure that you are using the current list, as the lists are updated every other year or so. The results of the wetland delineation could be different if the wrong list is used. This is a sample from the 2014 plant list. The date in the upper left corner that the green arrow is pointing to shows the effective date of the list. The far left column contains the scientific name. The scientific name consists of the genus and species of the plant, like a last name and then a first name. These names may change over time as more is known about plant growth and genetics. The delineation manuals and supplements are different based in part on precipitation regimes. Of course, precipitation is going to drive the kinds of plants that live in a region and where they grow best on the landscape. The two different status lists for Washington State are shown on the left in this document. The AW column refers to the Arid West Status Indicator List, and the column WMVC refers to Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coasts Status Indicator List. If you are working in higher precipitation areas in eastern Washington, you may need to use the Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coastal List for your site. For western Washington, the indicator status in the western mountain valley and coastal column applies. You can see that the wetland status is different between lists for toad flax and that the wetland status for red osier dogwood is the same. Scientific names change. For example, the yellow highlight above, many of us know it as red osier dogwood. The scientific name given in Pacific Northwest field guides is Cornus stolonifera or Cornus sericea, neither of which is listed here. The common names used may not be the common names that you are familiar with, and they may not be on the list. So what can you do if you don't see a plant name listed that you're familiar with? Try doing a Google search using the name that you are familiar with, and maybe other names will come up. You can then use those names to try to find your plant on this list. When all else fails, call an expert. Now that the plants are identified and their status indicators are known, doing some simple math based on statistical analysis methods is needed. Basically, to evaluate the plant community, you begin by looking at the most numerous plants in each of the 4 vegetation strata. Remember from before that woody vines are their own strata? Anyway, the 2 most common methods used are the 50-20 rule or the prevalence index. The 50-20 rule method starts by looking at each stratum separately, listing the dominant plants for each stratum that make up half of the total cover, adding in other dominant plants, and then combining the results for the final 50-20 calculation. Aerial cover is how much of the ground or sky is hidden by the plant when the plant is leafed out and you are looking at it from above or below the plant. You record the total area cover that all of the same plant species have within the defined observation plot area. If you start with the 50-20 rule, and if that yields a no answer, then you use the prevalence index technique to evaluate the vegetation if the soil and the hydrology parameters are already determined to be met. This is an example of the vegetation portion of the delineation form that has been filled out. All the plants in each stratum that are located in the plot around the soil pit observation hole are used. The percent of the plot that plants of the same species cover is recorded as absolute cover. You will note that one can have more than 100% of the plot covered because plants can grow underneath or over each other and they can cover the same patch of ground surface. The amount of ground surface that is necessary for a plant to cover and be considered a dominant plant is different for each strata. This is because it is a relative comparison against only the other plants that you find in that stratum. Once the dominant plants in each stratum are determined, then you consider all the dominant plants in all of the strata and complete the dominance test worksheet in the upper right-hand corner of the form. If A divided by B is greater than 50%, then you need go no further. You have met the 50-20 rule vegetation indicator. If the 50-20 indicator is not met, and you have hydric soils and hydrology indicators present, then the prevalence index worksheet needs to be filled out. Calculation of this indicator considers all of the plant species identified and weights their indicator status against the percent cover to come up with the answer. If this vegetation indicator fails as well, then you can consider whether there is evidence that the plants are adapting to wet conditions through morphological adaptations. Some plants can make adjustments to their bodies to deal with wet conditions. This adjustment is called a morphologic adaptation. Growing multiple trunks or stems when they typically only have one trunk or stem can be a sign of this type of adjustment in a plant. The plants are creating more surface area to take in oxygen from the air rather than from their roots. You can see the multiple trunks of alder trees that are adjacent to the water. Alders usually only have one single main trunk. Some plants grow roots out of their stems called adventitious roots. Corn plants are really good at doing this. I once found a cornfield in a delineated agricultural site where all the plants in the floodway in the lowest part of the field had sprouted adventitious roots. Ponderosa pine trees, especially when young, can survive for a long time by laying down very shallow root systems. They can tolerate wetter conditions by keeping their roots above a high water table. Ponderosa pines are usually FAC-up plants, so if they exhibit this adaptation, that can be noted on the delineation sheet and used as evidence that the plant in this area is functioning as a wetland plant. For the most part, the plants need to be identified to genus and species. If all the plants in a particular genus have the same status indicator, then it will not matter if the plant is identified to species. But if most of the plants on the form have not been identified to species, there should be a note by the delineator in the comment section as to why the plants were not identified. You may have to reject the delineation report and require the delineator to go back and do more work, especially if it is in a disturbed or a controversial site. Take the time to read the forms to see if everything is filled out to the level that it needs to be. If the 50-20 rule is satisfied, the prevalence index section does not need to be filled out. Delineation reports that are done during the driest time of the year or during the non-growing season should include a discussion in the report about how their report conclusions have taken that fact into account. Be very suspect of delineation reports that use field information gathered during the non-growing season or in the middle of a severe drought cycle. In eastern Washington, seasonal wetlands, or those that do not have water present during the whole growing season, can have some variation in the plant community location or plant species abundance over the course of the year and over the course of a 10-year hydrologic cycle. However, during a drought year, with photos taken in the late summer, some wetland areas in eastern Washington that are driven by groundwater recharge can really show up well. What if the native vegetation cover has been disturbed or replaced? The Arid West Delineation Manual has a section on problem areas and discusses methods used to evaluate plant cover that has been altered or disturbed, including use of reference sites close by that have not been impacted. Each manual supplement contains information on how to deal with common problems encountered in that region of the country. Contact an expert in delineation if you are in doubt or have questions about procedures used or conclusions reached in the wetland delineation report that you are reviewing.
Thank you for watching this portion of our educational series on wetland plants. Please don't hesitate to call us if you have any questions.